I stood at the gate, listening to my father's voice echo from inside before I even saw him. He was laughing, the kind of laugh that fills a room when everything feels perfectly in place. Someone mentioned my name, and he answered without hesitation. "Tammy, she's not part of this family anymore." The words weren't shouted. They were calm, ordinary, and that made them hurt more. For years, I told myself that silence was grace, that if I just worked harder, stayed patient, and kept proving my worth, one day they'd notice. But in that moment, standing outside the place I once called home, I finally understood. I wasn't invisible by accident. I'd been erased on purpose. Something inside me shifted, quietly, firmly. I wouldn't beg, and I wouldn't explain. Not this time. They thought I'd keep standing at the gate, forgotten. They had no idea what Tammy Caldwell was about to walk back through it. I used to think being forgotten was something a person could learn to live with. But that morning, outside the Charleston Naval Base, when the guard said my name wasn't on the list, I felt the sting of an old wound reopen, like it had been waiting for that exact moment. I stayed still, a leather bag in my hand, while he repeated it, polite but firm. The air smelled of salt and steel from the Cooper River. Inside the hall, I could hear the brass band warming up, bursts of laughter, the faint clinking of glass. They were honoring my father, Captain Robert Caldwell, the legend of Charleston Navy Yard, and my brother, Lieutenant Commander Mark Caldwell, the proud heir to that legacy. Me? Not on the list, not in the speeches, not even in the story. Through the glass, I saw my father shaking hands, his posture flawless, his pride unmistakable. When his eyes moved toward the door, they skipped over me as if I were part of the reflection, not the room. Behind him, Mark smiled under the lights, surrounded by photos titled "The Caldwell Men Who Served." Once again, I was the gap in their family portrait. I looked down at the Navy ID in my hand, the letters catching the sun like a quiet protest. I didn't plead. I didn't explain. I just drew a steady breath and said under my breath, "Maybe they never learned who I became." Then I turned away, not to leave, but to return on my own terms. The house I grew up in sat right by the Cooper River, a white two-story with wide windows and floors that carried the sound of every footstep. Each morning started the same way, the sharp rhythm of my father's boots against the wood. He lived by discipline, breathed through duty, and raised us on a single creed. Caldwell men never bend. Men. The word always hung there like a wall. Even as a child, I understood I was an exception, not an heir. While Mark ran through the yard with his model warships, I sat on the porch steps with one of Dad's old strategy manuals, tracing patterns on faded maps. I liked decoding things, seeing what others overlooked. When I was 16, he took Mark to the naval base for the first time, introduced him as the next officer. I stood beside my mother, wearing a plain white dress, when he added, almost kindly, "She's bright, but she's not built for command." It wasn't just a comment, it was a verdict. From then on, I learned to avoid the gatherings, to step out of the frame when the camera clicked. My mother would whisper that he didn't mean any harm, but unintentional wounds still leave scars. At 22, when Mark received his acceptance letter from the academy, the neighborhood erupted in celebration. Flags everywhere, barbecues, toasts. That same week, I opened an email from the Naval Intelligence Command offering me a position. I didn't tell my father. I left him a note instead. "I'm joining the Navy too." He didn't write back. The morning I left, he stood on the porch, arms crossed, and said only, "Don't waste your time behind a screen. Tammy, I just chose a different battlefield. Washington didn't smell like the ocean, but it carried the same heaviness of order." The first years at Naval Intelligence were long and sterile. Windowless rooms, rows of monitors, coded chatter in my headset. My job was to analyze electronic behavior, tracking unknown vessels across miles of open water. People called it desk work, but one wrong command could sink a ship. One overlooked signal could cost lives. In my 4th year, I was assigned to Operation Deep Current, a mission classified beyond clearance levels most officers would ever see. Our analysts had intercepted a scrambled chain of frequencies tied to a SEAL team missing off the Somali coast. I stayed at my station 39 hours straight, eyes fixed on the pulse of the radar until I found the source of the interference. When I rerouted the signal, communication came back. Within 17 minutes, they were extracted. The report listed the coordinator under a single word: Spectre. 3 months later, a letter arrived, no return address, just military handwriting. Whoever you are, Spectre, you saved us all. I folded the note carefully and locked it away with the rest of my unspoken victories. That evening, I called my mother. She asked how I was, then mentioned that my father was proud of Mark. He'd be in the local paper soon. I smiled at the window, watching the flag outside shift in the night wind. I know, I said. Nothing more. I had saved people who would never know my name and lost my place in the only story that was supposed to include me. Later. I opened the letter again. Tracing the word Spectre under the desk lamp, the silver pin on my uniform caught the light, a faint reflection against my chest. Maybe the world doesn't have to see me, I whispered, but one day, they'll have to face me. 4 years had passed since I last saw Charleston when my mother's letter arrived, folded carefully, sealed in quiet disobedience. She wrote that my father would be honored, that Mark would stand beside him, and then added, in her smallest, most familiar handwriting, "If you come, please don't say anything that might upset him." I must have read that line a dozen times. It sounded like every Sunday dinner I'd ever sat through, every phone call that ended before I could finish a sentence. Don't upset him. The words that built the walls of our house. I folded the letter, set it on my dashboard, and looked out across the Cooper River. Sunlight scattered across the surface like shards of glass, too bright to look at for long. Somewhere beyond the water was the house where my father still woke before dawn, straightened the flag on the porch, and made the world stand at attention. When I pulled into the driveway, it was like driving into a photograph. The same peeling white paint, the same flag angled perfectly toward the street, the same silence heavy enough to make your chest tighten. Inside, the air smelled of polish and old wood. My mother opened the door first. She smiled as she hugged me, the scent of her perfume faint and familiar. Then I saw Mark. He sat on the couch like he belonged there, at ease, confident, the golden sun. His smile faltered just slightly when he saw me. "Tammy! Look at you! Still working with computers?" "Something like that," I said, keeping my voice steady. His laugh was thin, nervous. He couldn't look me straight in the eye. For him, I was the shadow that reminded him how easy it was to be favored when someone else was kept out of sight. Then came my father, stepping out of his study. Even at home, he wore his uniform, every crease perfect. His gaze hit me like a cold wind. "You didn't tell me you were coming. You didn't invite me," I replied. He didn't flinch, just adjusted his cuffs and turned toward my brother. "Tomorrow's a big day for the Caldwell men. You can sit with your mother." That phrase, the Caldwell men, cut sharper than I expected. It was his way of putting me back in my place, drawing the same line he'd drawn my whole life. One side for legacy, the other for silence. That night, I stood on the porch. The river was black, the air thick with the smell of salt and diesel. I could still hear his voice from years ago, echoing in my head. Real service means facing danger. I smiled bitterly. He'd never understand the kind of danger I faced, the kind that never makes the papers, where every mistake costs lives and no one ever knows who saved them. 3 weeks after leaving Charleston, I received an encrypted call from Atlantic Command. The voice on the line was short, impersonal. "Commander Caldwell, report to Norfolk HQ. Orders classified. So to state." The conference room was silent when I entered. The kind of silence that absorbs every sound. 3 senior officers stood waiting behind a table of dark wood. The air smelled faintly of coffee and cold metal. "For extraordinary service under Operation Trident Veil, you are hereby promoted to Rear Admiral, effective immediately." They handed me a small silver box. Inside, the insignia gleamed, 3 stars, sharp and flawless. I raised my right hand, saluted, and held my breath as the paperwork was signed. No applause, no cameras. Only the sound of pen on paper and the echo of my own heartbeat. Recognition from my country came wrapped in solitude. The moment felt sacred and empty at once, like standing in a cathedral after everyone's gone home. As I turned to leave, an older admiral stopped me. He rested a hand on my shoulder and said quietly, "Spectre, you've saved more lives than you'll ever know." The word froze me in place. Spectre, my old call sign. The name buried with a mission no one was supposed to remember. I turned to look at him, but he just smiled. Some of the boys you saved, they still talk about you. Outside, the flag whipped hard against the wind. The sky washed pale with evening. I stood there for a moment, realizing that strangers knew the parts of me my own family refused to see. I decided then that this time, I wouldn't hide. I wouldn't send an email or wait for someone to ask. They would see with their own eyes what silence had built. Back in my apartment that night, I opened the box again. The stars reflected in the mirror, scattering light across the room like a quiet storm. I held one in my palm, cool and heavy, and whispered to myself, steady and sure. Tomorrow, I'm not coming as their daughter. I'm coming as who I really am. Charleston woke clear and metallic that morning, the sunlight cutting across the Cooper River like sharpened glass. I drove slowly over the bridge, passing rows of white uniforms marching toward the base. Their laughter drifted through the air, confident, easy, belonging. At the gate, a banner waved above the crowd. The Caldwell family celebration. I parked far from the entrance, letting the car idle. The sound of brass instruments floated from the hall, distant but distinct. I could almost hear my father's laugh in the rhythm of it, that familiar pride echoing across the years. When I finally stepped out, the wind smelled of salt and oil, heavy with memory. The security officer looked up from his clipboard. Name, ma'am, Caldwell, Tammy Caldwell. He frowned. Sorry, not seeing that here. The words landed soft but familiar. I smiled, not at him, but at the irony. Behind me, my father's voice carried through the speakers. To the Caldwell men of service, a chorus of glasses clinked, and laughter rippled out. The gate swung open for others, then closed again with a groan of iron. If that was the line dividing their world from mine, I knew it was time to cross it. Back at the car, I opened the trunk. Inside lay my dress whites, perfectly pressed, the navy box beside them. I lifted the lid. 3 silver stars gleamed cold in the light. As I buttoned the jacket, I felt every stitch like a pulse under my skin. This wasn't a costume. It was a truth I'd earned in silence. I took out a small silver coin, edges worn smooth. To Spectre, you saved us all. Pinning it to my uniform, I looked in the mirror. The woman staring back wasn't the forgotten daughter anymore. She was Rear Admiral Tammy Caldwell, United States Navy. When I reached the gate again, I held out my ID. Rear Admiral Caldwell, proceeding to the ceremony. The officer stiffened, keyed his radio. Copy that. Rear Admiral Caldwell entering. The band shifted to anchors away as I walked through. My steps matched the rhythm. I wasn't entering their story, I was reclaiming mine. The hall glowed gold beneath rows of flags. In the center, a banner read, honoring the Caldwell legacy of naval service. My father stood at the podium, voice commanding, proud. For generations, the Caldwell men have served with courage and valor. Applause thundered at that word. Men. I stepped into the light, the silver on my shoulders catching the glow. The host turned, stammering, Admiral? Every conversation fell silent as I walked down the aisle. Then, from the right, a man rose, scarred face, squared jaw, recognition in his eyes. Rear Admiral Caldwell, ma'am! Chairs scraped in unison. 300 Navy SEALs stood tall, saluting. The sound was a tide of steel and reverence, shaking the walls. Rear Admiral Caldwell, front row. My father froze mid-toast, the glass trembling in his hand. My mother pressed her chest, eyes wide with tears. Mark sat pale, lost for words. I reached the front, where an older admiral stood and nodded. Welcome home, Admiral. I sat in the front row, removed my cap, placed it on my lap. Silence rippled again. Then applause returned, hesitant, then roaring, rising like the sea. I didn't look at my family. I didn't need to. For the first time, the room saw me. Justice, I realized, wasn't revenge. It was simply standing where they once refused to let you stand. I touched the silver stars on my shoulder, steady as breath. They tried to erase me. Now, they'll have to remember. The room held its breath long after the applause died. Golden light shimmered against rows of medals, bouncing off my own silver stars until it painted me into the picture they'd tried to keep me out of. I didn't rise or bow. I sat perfectly still, eyes fixed on the stage where my father stood frozen, his glass half raised. That look, I knew it too well. Not pride, not anger, just disbelief, the kind that forces a man to see the truth he spent a lifetime denying. Mark sat off to the side, his shoulders drawn in, as if realizing that every story he'd been told was missing a chapter. The host cleared his throat, voice shaking. "Admiral Caldwell, please, front row." I stood. My heels struck the wood floor in a rhythm I could feel in my bones. Every step forward echoed the moments I'd once been told to stay quiet, to sit small, to let the men talk. When I took my seat, the admiral in front of me turned slightly and said, almost gently, "It's good to finally see the face behind Spectre." The word rippled through the silence. My father's fingers loosened. The glass trembled once, then rested on the table. No one spoke. The stillness carried more weight than any applause. As America the Beautiful filled the hall, I placed my hand over my chest, feeling the cool edge of the 3 stars. For the first time, I wasn't waiting to be seen. I was part of the story. When the ceremony ended, voices returned like soft waves breaking on a dock. I waited until most had left before hearing my brother behind me. "How long have you been keeping this a secret?" 15 years, I said. He gave a small, uneven laugh. "Guess you were always 10 steps ahead of me." His eyes fell. I just never looked close enough. I rested a hand on his shoulder. "You weren't supposed to." Dad made sure of that. He nodded and walked away, shoulders heavy, not angry, just hollow, learning what it meant to be proud of something built on someone else's silence. Then my father approached. The hall was nearly empty, sunlight catching in the glass behind him. He stopped in front of me, eyes moving from the insignia on my shoulders to my face. No words, no hesitation. He raised his right hand in a perfect salute. I returned it, posture firm, breath steady. For a moment, we stood facing each other. 2 officers, 2 lives divided by pride, finally meeting as equals. He didn't call me daughter. He didn't have to. In that silent exchange, he gave me the one thing I'd wanted all my life: respect. News spread faster than I ever imagined. By morning, Charleston's military forums were flooded with photos from the ceremony. 300 Navy SEALs stood to honor Rear Admiral Tammy Caldwell. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages poured in. Congratulations, apologies, quiet thank yous. Among them was one email from an unnamed address. "Spectre, you changed the meaning of command. SEAL Team 8. That one made me pause. In the afternoon, my mother called. Her voice was soft, trembling slightly. "He's been quiet since last night. Keeps looking at your photo, you know." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Then she added, almost in a whisper, "I think he finally sees you. Tammy, not as a daughter, as who you are." I smiled, tears slipping before I could stop them. Sometimes recognition comes too late, but still, it comes. A week later, I drove back to the house on the river, the same winding road, the same oak trees, the same flag waving steady on the porch. Inside, my mother was cooking roast, the smell warm and heavy in the air. My father sat in the living room, silent, a metal case on the table, but the glass cabinet behind him had changed. Mark's photo was still there, yet at the center now hung mine, in full dress whites, beneath a plaque that read, "Rear Admiral Tammy Caldwell, United States Navy." I looked at my mother. She just smiled. My father stood and approached. "Do they still call you Spectre?" "Sometimes," I said. He nodded once. "You did well, Admiral." No more words. None were needed. That night, we ate together for the first time in years. No ranks, no pride, no silence, just family. I drove out of Charleston at dawn. The sun climbed over the Ravenel Bridge, turning the steel cables into threads of silver. I rolled down the window, letting the wind carry in the scent of salt and the cry of gulls. In the distance, the Sullivan's Island lighthouse cut through the fog, steady and unmoving. I thought of the hall, the scrape of chairs, the flash of light on my shoulders, the moment 300 SEALs stood as one. I didn't want to forget it, but I didn't need to live there anymore. For years, I thought silence was my punishment. I whispered, half to the wind, half to myself. That day, I learned it was my power. I pressed the accelerator. The road stretched straight toward the sea. No applause, no spotlight, just the hum of the engine, and a heart finally at peace.